Welcome to the Real Paranormal Stories podcast with your host, Christopher Buckner. Send your stories to realparanormalstoriespodcast@gmail.com. Royalty-free music provided by Kevin MacLeod and Tabletop Audio. And now, let's take a trip into the paranormal. This story comes from Reddit user MotoX99, and this is their story. I've had two experiences in my lifetime so far. Currently in my 30s, most recent was about 2 years ago. I lived alone in a one-bedroom apartment in California. A couple weeks leading up to the event, I kept having a feeling I was being watched as I laid in bed before falling asleep. Then one night, I woke up just past 3 a.m. and had a feeling I was being watched again. I lifted my head off the pillow to look towards my door and immediately felt a hand smack the side of my head and pushed it back into the pillow. Completely freaked out, I jumped out of bed and turned on every light. Ran around my whole apartment and found nothing. I was alone. However, my first experiences happened when I was around 12 years old. My family and I, mom, dad, and sister, had just moved into a new house in Colorado. The weird stuff started happening on the first night in the new house. I had a bunk bed at the time. Top bunk was the bed and the bottom was a desk. On the first night, shortly after I got into bed, I felt the whole bed start shaking. It felt as if someone was grabbing one of the bedposts and was violently shaking the bed with their hands. It lasted about 5 or so minutes. This happened every single night that I slept in my bed in that house. I tried explaining to my parents what was happening, but they brushed it off like I was crazy. Never believed me. A few months after moving into the house, my alarm clock would start going off at random times in the middle of the night, and always at a different time. My dad was getting furious at me for waking him up, but at that point in my life, I never used my alarm feature on that clock. Not one time had I ever physically turned on the alarm. As much as I pleaded with my parents, they never believed me. I should also add that my sister had an identical bed in her own separate room and never experienced her bed shaking or anything else weird. We only lived in that house for about 1.5 years, and immediately after moving, all of those experiences stopped. That bed never shook again. Alarm never went off again. Years later, my dad would admit that he experienced some weird things in that house as well. Never brought it up for fear of embarrassment. On one particular night, he heard a loud noise in the hallway in front of my room. Being a work night, he was pretty upset, thinking I was messing around late at night and had woken him. He got up out of bed and peeked his head out the door. He swears he saw a shadowy figure standing in front of my door. Completely freaked him out, and he immediately jumped back into bed. Made me question why he never believed me when I was telling him all the stuff going on in my room at the time. I think he just refused to believe anything like that could ever be real or possible. Those are my experiences with the weird or paranormal. And that is their story. This story comes from Reddit user RiceCakeU_. And this is their story. Back when I was 12 to 14, I had really bad sleep paralysis. Almost every night without fail, I would go to sleep just to wake up a few hours later, completely unable to move. My bed was facing the doorway at the time. Every time I had sleep paralysis, a tall, dark figure with a top hat and a pocket watch would stand at my doorframe and watch me. I knew he had a pocket watch because it dangled from his pants, and I could always hear the tick of the seconds going by. This entity gave me really bad vibes, so this alone freaked me out. I talked with my therapist at the time and my PCP, and I was prescribed sleeping medication, and my sleep paralysis soon stopped. When I was 15, I started dating this really toxic guy. I was in a relationship with him for a dreadful 2 years. At some point, I think about a year and some odd months in, me and him are sitting in my room playing Minecraft. About 30 minutes into playing, he looks into the hallway outside of my room and just instantly starts bawling. I had never seen this guy cry before. After about 15 minutes of him crying and freaking out, I got him to finally speak to me. He explained to me that a tall, dark figure with a top hat and pocket watch told him that he needed to leave me alone or he'd off his entire family. I never once told him about my sleep paralysis, let alone told him about the entity that would visit me during it. So, yeah, that creeped me out a lot. I ended up telling some of my friends about it, and they all were pretty weirded out by it too. But whatever, right? Crazy coincidence. Whenever I would bring up the entity, I called him James. No clue why, but that's just the name I felt belonged to him. However, there has always been strange things happening at our house. A random weird smell, things moving, my door shutting, knocking, you name it. A few days ago, I decided to tell my grandfather, who I live with, about my experiences with this entity while one of my friends was over at the house. My grandfather got this confused look on his face and said, a pocket watch. His name is James? I told him yes, and he said nothing else, then went downstairs. Me and my friend looked at each other and we were like, okay. Then about 10 minutes later, he came back upstairs with a box. He opened the box and proceeded to pull out a pocket watch with the name James W. Cunningham engraved on the back. My jaw dropped and I was speechless. He proceeded to tell me that the pocket watch belonged to his grandfather and gave it to him before he passed. I still can't wrap my head around this fully. And that is their story. That's all for this episode of the Real Paranormal Stories podcast. If you liked what you heard, please leave us a review anywhere this podcast can be found.